Hello, ladies and gents. Welcome back. Now today we are going to go probably about as far back in time as any video on this channel is likely to go. Because today we are going to look at an event that happened really sometime between the evening of the 18th of March and the morning of the 19th of March in 1286. This is an event that in many ways was the catalyst, the spark that led to 200 or more really years worth of conflict between England and Scotland. And that's a conflict that in a lot of ways comes to define Scotland's late medieval history. Now that event is the death of King Alexander III of Scotland. Now Alexander III was in most respects quite a successful king. He had made great steps forward for the Scottish royal administration in spreading the influence of the royal administration throughout Scotland, establishing royal authority in areas of the kingdom where it had previously been fairly weak or indeed had not existed at all. He had done great work in spreading royal authority west into the Western Highlands, out into the Hebrides, bringing these areas from Norwegian control into Scottish control. He had also made great steps forward in normalizing relations with England. He had been very forceful in terms of stressing the separateness of Scotland and England, ensuring that it was clear that the King of Scots held the Kingdom of Scotland in his own right, not as a kind of vassal of the English state. But he had also promoted quite healthy, quite friendly relations between the two kingdoms. Cross-border landholding was quite common. Lots of men in Scotland, lots of powerful men in Scotland also had land in England, and he had managed to maintain these cross-border links without really undermining his own personal authority within the kingdom. Where he had been less successful had been in establishing his dynasty, ensuring that he had plenty of offspring who could be expected to carry on his legacy beyond his death. He had outlived not only his first wife, but also his two sons and also his daughter. This left him with a very young granddaughter, Margaret, who, because his mother had married into the Norwegian royal family, at the time of the event that we're looking at today, in 1286, Margaret was 3 years old and was living in her native Norway. Now, Alexander had managed to gain recognition by the Scottish political community that in the event of his death, Margaret would be recognised as his heir, and efforts would be made to bring her to Scotland so that she could, she could be established as Queen of Scots in her own right. Nevertheless, that was hardly an inspiring situation for a medieval king to be. The prospect of leaving a infant daughter to become the first ruling Queen of Scots in her own right was certainly cause for concern at the time. Alexander, though, was not especially old, even by the standards of the time, only in his 40s, in the 1280s. And he had, not that long before his death, married a new young bride, Yolande of Dreux, are open to correction on how to pronounce that term, I will make sure it's in the description. So don't be shy about correcting me in the comments below, because I'm not particularly confident that's how to pronounce her name. Anyway, he had married this lady. She was young, quite beautiful from what we're told, and he had, of course, already produced a great many children and could expect to live, a good few more years, decades, in which he might very well produce offspring, produce heirs who could take over and carry on the work of his royal administration after his death. Now, on the 18th of March, 1286, Alexander had spent the day, and indeed into the evening, in Edinburgh, which on our map is right there, just on the south side of the Firth of Forth, that big stretch of water down there. Yolande was in Kinghorn in Fife, which is almost directly opposite Edinburgh, on the north side of the Firth of Forth. Now, Alexander spent the day at Edinburgh Castle. He seems to have attended a feast in the evening, a great deal of celebration with a number of his magnates, but he decided that he wanted to spend the night with Yolande. Now, to get to Kinghorn from Edinburgh, even today, you can't easily just go straight over that stretch of water. To get there, you need to move west ride west, of course, in the medieval period, west along the coast, along the edge of the Firth of Forth, to Dalmeny, or South Queensferry, and nowadays there is a bridge. In 1286 there was a ferry, the Queen's Ferry, which would take you from Dalmeny to Inverkeithing on the northern side of the river, of the Firth of Forth, or North Queensferry. Now, the weather on the 18th to the 19th of March in 1286 was far from clement. There was a storm brewing. We have a very evocative, quite emotive account of Alexander's last day that comes from the writings of John of Forden, Scots chronicler, or Scottish chronicler, actually writing in Latin, writing in the 1360s. Now, I have to be somewhat careful of Forden's account, because, as I say, he's writing in the 1360s, 80 years nearly after the events that he's chronicling, and of course writing in light of both the First War of Scottish Independence and the Second War of Scottish Independence. So Forden is quite aware of the dramatic consequences of Alexander's death, and is perhaps too eager to stress the drama of the situation, because he knows what the outcome, what the aftermath of the event was. Nevertheless, the weather does seem to have been particularly inclement as far as we can tell. Alexander, Forden tells us, is warned by his magnates who are with him at Edinburgh, don't go, save it till the morning, save it till the storm is over, but Alexander won't be turned aside, and he rides, sure enough, with only 3 squires, quite a small entourage, quite frankly, for the King of Scots. He rides along the south edge of the River Forth to Dalmeny, where again he is told by the ferryman that it's too dangerous and that the king should stay behind. And one of the burgesses, one of the wealthy men, the merchants who live in Dalmeny, offers to put the king up in his townhouse for the night, but again the king won't be turned aside, and he insists that the ferryman takes him across, and he actually manages to get across the River Forth all the way, or the Firth of Forth all the way to Inverkeithing. And then he begins the ride with his 3 squires, remember, along the northern edge, the northern shore of the Firth of Forth, and he gets very close, it seems, to Kinghorn. But the storm closes in, and in the wind and the rain and the confusion, Alexander becomes separated from his squires, and no one can find him again until the morning, when his broken, shattered corpse is found at the foot of a cliff near to Kinghorn. It would appear that during the night, King Alexander and his horse got lost in the wind and the rain and the darkness, stumbled over the cliff, and Alexander is now dead. Now, for what's the word I'm looking for? For simplicity's sake, I suppose. Very often histories of the period will present Alexander's death as being a huge, catastrophic disaster for the Scots. And there's maybe something to that again when we look in sort of the long term. Certainly we can trace to that day in particular a great many of Scotland's problems and the subsequent succession crisis that ensues to Alexander's premature and it seems quite preventable death. But frankly, at the time, it's not quite such a catastrophe, not quite such a disaster for the Scots as the later consequences might suggest. Actually, the Scots show remarkable resolve and organisation and unity in responding to Alexander's death. Very shortly afterwards, there is a council of 6 guardians put together in order to effectively govern Scotland until the new queen, as it is, can be installed and a new royal administration can form around her. So these 6 men are actually surprisingly representative of the kingdom as a whole. We have representation from the Highlands but also from the Lowlands. We have 2 earls representing the great magnates of the kingdom, but we also have 2 barons representing the lower echelons of the nobility, and of course we have 2 bishops, 2 clerics who are there to represent the clergy, to represent the second estate, if you like, those who pray. This is quite an impressive bit of socio-political organisation from the Scots. Quite sophisticated, quite civilised in the grand scheme of things, again challenging some of these notions that people often have about medieval Scotland as being this very rough and ready and very disorganised, unharmonious, unsophisticated kind of a place. And these guardians set to work organising Margaret's transport from Norway to Scotland, ready for her to be inaugurated at Scone. Scone is near Perth. Scone is just up in that sort of area of our map. I don't know how well you can see that really on our in this footage. Anyway, not only do the Guardians make arrangements to have Margaret brought to Scotland, but they also make arrangements with Scotland's southern neighbour, with Edward I, basically to ensure a marriage alliance between Margaret, Maid of Norway as she's often known, and Edward II, basically the future Edward II, Edward I's son and heir. This is, of course, to ensure continued good relations between the two kingdoms. Edward I had been Alexander III's brother-in-law. Alexander's first wife was Edward's sister. Now, one of the possible risks here in arranging the Treaty of Bergen, as it's known, is that if the future Edward II marries Margaret, who is of course going to be Queen of Scots, then Edward conceivably could unite the two kingdoms. We could have an organic union of the crowns in the late 13th, early 14th century. But the Treaty of Bergen specifically prepares for this and counteracts that possibility by insisting that the law, we could now see the same person becoming King of Scots and King of England, that the laws and customs and so forth, the unique legal and social elements that make up the Scottish kingdom are to be respected, are to be maintained, and that the two kingdoms will remain fundamentally separate despite potentially having the same individual as their monarch. So, not quite the catastrophic break, the miserable disaster that it is sometimes presented as, the death of Alexander. The Scots respond quite well in quite an organised and sophisticated and intelligent way to this crisis. The real problem comes in 1290, when Margaret, Maid of Norway, finally starts wending her way towards Scotland, because she gets as far as Orkney, which actually isn't on this map, it's kind of a way up that way. Still Norwegian territory in 1290. There she takes ill, or is possibly taken ill on the way over, and she dies. She never actually makes it to Scotland. She never becomes inaugurated as Margaret, Queen of Scots. And now there is a huge question mark looming over that title, the King of Scots, because now it is not entirely clear who should succeed, who should take over from Margaret. And two big power blocks start to form within Scotland. Two factions that are genuinely threatening from this point on to potentially start fighting, to start causing really serious trouble over this issue of who should be king. One faction, of course, is based around John Balliol, the Lord of Galloway. Galloway is down there in the southwest. And one based around Robert Bruce, Lord of Annandale. Annandale is actually also down there in the southwest, right on the border with England. This is the grandfather, of course, of the future King Robert I of Scotland. Now, these two have the strongest claims to be King of Scots, and at least in that initial period, they are the two who emerge as kind of clear favourites. Really, ladies and gents, and I'm sure we will come back and do a video just on this particular issue later on, but it has to be said, the Balliol claim, by the kind of legal standards of the time, is stronger than the Bruce claim. But the Bruces can't just be cool and get on with it. No, they have to keep rabble-rousing, they keep having to make this trouble to keep pressing their own claims. And I mean, of course they do. That's what you do if you're a medieval magnate. You don't get ahead in medieval politics by being a shy, retiring type. You have to push your advantages, you have to press for your ambitions if you want to succeed in the world of late medieval Scottish politics, or indeed English politics or French politics, or the politics of any of these big Western European kingdoms. Anyway, as this problem intensifies, as the threat that things might boil over into actual violence grows greater, the Scots turn to, maybe, Edward I. Or possibly Edward invites himself, or possibly a little of column A and a little of column B. Again, we might look in more detail at the intricacies of this particular aspect of this sequence of events in a later video. But one way or another, whether he's invited or whether he invites himself, Edward I does end up stepping in to mediate this dispute. Now, that choice with hindsight might seem like a pretty zany one from the Scots, but remember, Edward I was Alexander III's brother-in-law, and over the course of the last 100 or so years, certainly over the course of Alexander III's reign, Anglo-Scottish relations have been generally on the increase. The story of Anglo-Scottish relations in the 13th century has generally been one of increasing cooperation, increasing friendship. Edward I, of course, is also famous as a great legislator, a great legal mind. So he seems at the time to be exactly the person to call on to mediate this dispute in a legal, formal, non-violent sense. Now again, we'll come on to how that decision pans out, that mediation pans out in other videos, I'm sure. But the long and the short of it is he ends up finding in favour of John Balliol, who, as I mentioned before, really did have the stronger legal claim. The internal problems of Scotland don't really go away with the end of that decision, or the making of that decision rather. The Bruces still just can't be cool and just get on with it. They continue to put pressure on the Balliol regime, and other internal problems continue to beset the Balliols. But also, over the course of John Balliol's rule, it becomes painfully clear that Edward I is not satisfied merely with helping the Scots out to settle their succession dispute and then stepping aside and letting them get on with things. He is eager to use this, to exploit this opportunity to reassert long-standing English claims of sovereignty and suzerainty over the whole of Scotland. This interference leads to a very serious breakdown in Anglo-Scottish relations, and in 1296 we see the English invading Scotland, beginning a conflict known as the First War of Scottish Independence, which will last until 1328, and even then we get arguably 4 or 5 years worth of actual peace, and then the English invade again. Really, from this period onwards, as I intimated at the start of the video, you are looking at 200 years or more of intermittent conflict between England and Scotland, conflict that will have an enormous influence over the shape and the story of Scotland's late medieval history. The sort of stuff that we will continue exploring in subsequent videos. So, ladies and gents, that is a very kind of potted history of the event itself, the death of Alexander III, as I say, sometime in the on the 18th of March 1286, or possibly in the very early hours of the morning on the 19th of March in 1286. And also, hopefully this video has given you some idea of the consequences, the outcomes, the aftermath of the event itself. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you found it interesting. Any questions you have, do feel free to pose them in the comments below and tell me how to pronounce Yolande, or the name of the place where she comes from. I won't embarrass myself by trying that again. Otherwise though, thank you very much, ladies and gents. Hopefully we'll see you again for some more videos very soon.